Okay, today we're just looking at updating the firmware for the Panasonic GH6. So as it stands, there isn't a firmware update for the body, but there are firmware updates for some of the lenses. So the first thing we're going to do is take a memory card, and I'm just using quite a small card because the way it kind of works is that you'll need to format the card. So the first thing we have to do is jump in and get this card formatted. So rather than having to erase cards all the time, I just use this small card and just have it. It's just a tiny 16 gig card, so we just format that, and then we're ready to jump onto the computer and start getting the firmware onto it, ready to update the lens. Okay, so the lens that I'm looking to update is the 35 to 100mm. So you can see here it's got the code for it. You should also be able to see on the bottom of the lens it's usually got this code on there. So all we need to do is copy that, and then if we jump into the firmware downloads link, I'll add this into the description. You can kind of see how it's all laid out. So there are camera body firmware updates here. At the time of recording this, there aren't any GH6 ones. We're on firmware version 1. There are some coming, but I don't know any dates for those. But we're looking for the ones for the lenses. So you can either go through manually, which obviously you have to remember it all, or you can just jump into here, paste it, hit search. It doesn't actually search for it, all it does is highlight it. So you can see if we keep scrolling, here it is. And you can see there is a new firmware update for it. Some of them are slightly different. So you can see the new firmware update for the GH6 autofocus features, March the 1st, 2020. That's the latest one. But you can see, depending on the lens you've got, it might be 1.4, 1.2. There's some here that are 1.3 and 1.1. In our case, this is the lens we want. It's version 1.2. So we just come over to here, download that, and you can see it just opens up this window here. So if we hit download and read through all of this, and then we accept all of that, and then that's going to go off and do our download for us. If I can just get that pop-up window back as well. So the other thing, it gives you all the information here. So if you hadn't already updated to the 1.1 version, the lens, should just ship at version 1. So there's a couple of little updates here that have been added back in, back in June 2021, and then this is the latest one here. So 1.2, and then it's got the AF operation in the sort of VFR modes, the high frame rates. So that should be a nice little extra feature to have. So if we also click into here, check the procedure for the update. So there's quite important things on here that we need to do. So 100% check that you're installing the right firmware for the right lens. Make sure that right lens is on the camera as well, and it needs to be on the camera. You can't have the wrong lens on there and try and update the firmware. So just be sure that those both match up. It's the right lens on the camera, it's the right firmware you've downloaded. And you also need to format the memory card. So that is something that if you don't do it, it will struggle to find the firmware. So just put the camera into the card and format it. And then the last thing we need to remember for this is to have a fully charged battery, or as close to that as you can get, because these updates can take a few minutes, and if the battery fails halfway through, then that's going to be a problem because you're going to have incomplete firmware on the lens. And the same goes for switching the camera on and off. Don't do that whilst it's trying to do a firmware update. It will do the update and then it will reboot. Don't switch it off because you think it's stopped or crashed or anything like that. Just let it run. Okay, and then we've got the preparation for it. So you can see we're checking the versions, and we'll jump in and do this on the camera. Download the firmware. So the file will download as a zip file, which we can have a look at now. That is come here. So that's our file that we just got, and then what we need to do is extract it. So if we, in this case, double click it, I'm on a Mac, So I've got a lin file here, and then what we need to do, our card that we'd already formatted, we can jump in to do that. Mine's just called Lumix, that's what it tends to call them when you format them in the camera. Drop that into Lumix, leave the zip file, we don't need that, and then you should end up with something that looks like this. So a DCIM folder, a private folder, and then a lin folder. You may not see these are hidden folders. And then that is pretty much ready to go, so we can eject that card. That can come out now. Make sure you eject it properly, and you'll be able to see on here, what else have we got? And that's just about adding it into there, which we've just done, and then we'll go on to the next bit. So this is that's for a body firmware update. So we'll jump into the camera now, and we'll finish this off, and you can see how to get this done. Okay, so we've added the firmware file to the root of this card. In this case, it was a .lin file. We extracted it from the zip, put in that file, and then we're ready to switch on the camera and see if we've got any firmware updates in there. So if we go to the spanner, and then if you click up, it will take you to this bottom spanner, and you can see firmware update is just there at the bottom. So we jump in, we've got 1.2 on the card, and you can see our lens firmware is version 1.0. So when we hit update, it should tell us that we can update, and it's thinking about it. And yes, let's start the update. So just before you do this, make sure you've got a fully charged battery. They say it can take a few minutes, it usually takes less, but let's see how it goes. It should be fairly quick because it's a lens update. Okay, and the camera's just rebooted itself. So great, we've installed the firmware there, and it took just short of a minute to install that. So that's great. So that's done now. If you are planning to use the card again, be sure just to format the card again, because that firmware file is still sat on the root of the card. So don't make the mistake of installing it by mistake, or if you leave it on there and then in the future you want to update another lens or the body, if you've got two firmware files on there, it just confuses everything. So the best thing to do, if it's not your firmware update card, or even if it is, just do another format on that card, and then it's ready to go for the next time you want to do it. So now with that update, we should have the new autofocus features that have been added into version 1.2. So hopefully that helped. If you're looking for more GH6 content, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you've got any questions on anything about firmware updates, just leave them in the comments.